Greetings to everyone here in this room. It is a real pleasure to have you all here. With me today is Glenn Carle. Glenn Carle retired as Deputy National Intelligence Officer. He was the head of the Office of Transnational Threats. He had a long and illustrious career in the CIA. Some would say the dreaded CIA, some would say the infamous CIA. Glenn is an author, Glenn is a geopolitical analyst, Glenn is also a senior partner at Fair Observer Intelligence, along with Vikram Sood, who retired as chief of RAW, India's version of CIA. Now, on behalf of Fair Observer and IIT Gandhinagar, I'm welcoming Glenn. Please give him a big hand. Let's move on to what the Harvard boys did to Russia, something we wrote about in December. And of course, you were working on the Soviet Union then, and your argument was that you had to build rule of law, privatization had to be gradual, and so on and so forth. But there was a sexier Harvard man named Jeffrey Sachs, the sexy Sachs. Well, that may be his new name going forward, hopefully, from now on. And he had this glorious idea of shock therapy. And shock therapy literally meant that privatize everything very quickly. And this meant that assets were sold to crooks at a pittance. And that time, looking back now, hindsight is 20/20, but that period has led directly to what we are facing now, a criminalized Russia, arguably the Russia-Ukraine war. Looking back, where do you think the US went wrong? And what did Sachs get wrong? Yeah. Because clearly, you've been vindicated by time, but why did the White House, why did the president go with Sachs? Why not with you?
Well, there are multiple levels that all of you need to understand, and this is a huge issue. However, the question and my work at the time is not, the question is not about, and my work at the time was not intelligence work. I am and was a CIA officer. However, for years, I was detailed, I was seconded, I was given over from, this is true, this is not me telling fibs, from the CIA to the White House. Many of the officers who staff the jobs in the executive office of the president, the large majority actually, come from elsewhere in the federal government. They might be a colonel from the Army.
They could be from the US Treasury.
From the US Treasury, yeah. or given by the CIA to do various jobs. And so that's what my job was then involved in trade negotiations, because my master's degree is in European studies. I was a European specialist and international economics. So I had some solid background in economics, which distinguished me from not all. I mean, there are people who are true economists in the CIA, but distinguished me from many CIA officers. And it was an advanced degree, not just a bachelor's. So I was seconded to the White House at the time that Atul is referring to in 1990. Well, it's, 91 to 97. I mean, I was not there all that period of time. So that's where I was. I was not doing CIA work. I was doing trade negotiation, commercial, economic stuff, and policy. That's another very important distinction, which you won't believe, but it is absolutely true. It's critical to understand. The CIA does not make policy. What the CIA does is a policy, can shape policy, but we don't make it. The White House says, invade this, it says, come up with an invasion plan for Afghanistan, or how can we mine harbors in Nicaragua? These might be terrible things, and they are clearly dramatic policies, but we do them because we're ordered to do so. That's a distinction. That's another subject.
You mean the politicians are the real bad guys? You're just instruments of these bad guys in power.
Yeah, you could say we're completely amoral tools. I mean, that's truly what the CIA is. And to be amoral is problematic too, but that's also another very important, big issue, but a separate one. So I was at the White House doing trade. The Soviet Union fell and collapsed. The entire economy and society had been collectivized. There was no private property. The money, the currency, the financial structures, the banks, it was all centralized, and it was not a capitalist market economy. So the policy of the United States government was not, as Vladimir Putin asserts, to destroy Russia, but actually to help it integrate into the capitalist international system. The question is, how do you do that? If there are 200 million people in a country and no one owns anything, but they live in an apartment that the state has owned, and the state no longer will keep it because it's led to poverty, less efficient economic growth, and blah, 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 blah. What do you do? And there are various plans. And this man, Atul alludes to...
The sexy Sachs?
Jeffrey Sachs was a professor at Harvard. He's basically, I don't know if you've done economics, but he's basically a monetarist, a free market monetarist. He believes in shock therapy was his term. You immediately privatize everything, and the shock will make you healthier. Jump into the cold water, and you'll come out feeling invigorated. Well, that sounds great. But
except that Russia jumped into the cold water and had a heart attack.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It will probably kill you. It's a very hard thing to transform the way anything is done, and particularly the foundations of economic and social intercourse. But he recommended that, and it was actually not the United States government, but it was the Russian government that hired him, and they followed his policies, which led to cataclysmic changes in Russia. The Russian GDP shrank by, was it 33% or 67%? I forget which.
You can read it in our article. By a third, I think.
A third.
Yeah.
And there's real hardship.
I may be wrong, though.
There's real hardship when an economy has a recession and production drops by 2% for 6 months. But this was, people could not feed themselves, not just for a meal. It was a cataclysm. The life savings of the entire population were wiped out. No one owned anything, and it led to the rise of ruthless, organized mafiosa crime, and that came to impregnate and define and control the state, most of which was controlled by the former, or still serving KGB, the Russian equivalent of CIA officers, and it led to disastrous results. At the time, I did have some responsibilities for Russia on trade, and I was not a major, no one's listening or asking my advice, certainly in the White House, but I was among those who thought that this shock therapy was a lunatic idea. I'm not a monetarist. A monetarist is a very conservative, free market, the state has no role believing person. Everything will be fine if everyone does whatever they want. Well, this sounds very nice, but as a French thinker from the 19th century said, well, his name is Anatole France, he said, this kind of freedom is the freedom for all of us to live under the bridge and starve, because we don't have a job and we have no home. And that's what resulted. But those of us, and I was this in the scope of this room, if my role was maybe like that, who argued against that lost the argument, and this radical free market shock therapy economics was the American policy. It led to terrible destruction in Russia, which was not the United States objective, and understandably, to lasting resentment, hatred, and belief by many that the U.S. truly sought to destroy Russia in this moment of triumph in the Cold War. And that wasn't the policy, but that is what happened.
So interestingly, I'm sure you've met Russian counterparts who've said this, and I've met Russian friends who've said that Jeffrey Sachs was a CIA plant, and this was a CIA plot to undermine Russia from within. And this is an article of faith for many Russians.
It's wrong, but it's an article of faith.
Yeah.
I just heard Jeffrey Sachs on television the other day, first time I'd seen him for a long time, saying equally stupid, pardon me, because he's a Harvard professor and considered an expert.
No, he's a Columbia professor now.
Columbia now, that's right.
So you can abuse him all you want.
He's migrated to say stupid things elsewhere. Equally stupid things about President Biden's recent success on having a bill passed that will take some steps to work on America's infrastructure and global warming and energy-related issues. And
all right.
So
let's get to the 9/11
I don't think
attack.
Sachs was hostile. He certainly wasn't sent by the CIA or the U.S. government to destroy Russia, and I think I totally believe he's sincere in his in trying to do good by them. But people up until about the year 1900, as doctors, thought they were doing good things, and they were actually doing hideous things to our bodies, and that's what Sachs did.
So the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Absolutely.
All right. So let's fast forward now. You've had 10 years after 1991. Everything is going hunky-dory. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The CIA, of course, has no wall to lean onto, and so you're a bit miffed. People are getting fired in the CIA, and then dramatically 9/11 happens. And of course, the CIA now has a new avatar. So has a new avatar, a new incarnation. So walk us through what happens to the US and to the CIA post 9/11.
Yeah, I've spent the last, excuse me one second, sniffle. Pardon me. I've spent the last 25 years of my life, almost literally, focused more than anything professionally on Islamic terrorism. And as I have mentioned, I was, my academic specialization was Europe and economics. And I would like to spend my energies thinking about flying a rocket to Mars or reading about a new development in artificial intelligence or how to save the whales or something. But I've devoted most of my energies to Islamic terrorism, something that's...
Hang on a minute. You were negotiating with the Taliban before 9/11 for 3.5 years.
That's why I say 25 years. I'll get to that. And, rather than having to focus on something inspired from 7th century, a misunderstanding of 7th century theology in the 21st century, but it's just a tragic waste of much of the world's energies. So how did that happen? I and the CIA, my colleagues in the CIA did not know specifically what would happen on September 11, 2001, but that such an event occurred was no surprise at all. And I had spent, by that point, 5 years myself working on Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism. And the reason that happened is because I was asked what issues I would like to work on in a new assignment, and I said, I don't know why I said this actually, but I said, well, I'm interested in Afghanistan, and I had no background whatsoever. Well, almost no background.
You had read too much Kim, and you had read about the Great Game, and you're Anglo-Saxon at the end of the day.
I'd read Kipling, and I guess no, that's not. Well, I had read Kipling, but that's not why. So I asked for Afghanistan, and I was made, since Afghanistan at the time, in the mid-1990s, was of no interest to most American officials, they said, well, sure, you can have it. So So I became the responsible person, one of very, very few, for Afghanistan, which meant that I actually negotiated with the Taliban 5 years before 9/11, and it was fascinating work. And Islamic terrorism was not a product of Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden or the attack of September 11. It has been an issue for many decades. Islamic terrorists have been killing colleagues of mine for all my career, for many, many years. And it predates anything that America did because, and this is a controversial statement within the terrorism expert community, but I will stand by it. It is a response, an Islamic response to social dislocation and the presence of Western norms and the Industrial Revolution, going back to the birth of the Industrial Revolution in the 1830s and 40s and the first encounters of traditional Islamic societies with, quote, the modern world and Western norms from the time that Napoleon showed up in Egypt or the Raj was, mucking around in the Northwest Frontier Province.
So how did the world change?
Well, the world changed the world changed in two ways.
Yeah.
In the slightly narrower sense, it became the obsession, it became the mission, it being terrorism, and terrorism meant fundamentally Islamic terrorism, of the U.S. intelligence community. And that was because of the decisions of the White House. Mm-hmm. And therefore, in the larger sense, it became the leitmotif, the driving, defining issue for the United States for all of your lives, tragically, for 20 plus years. It was a tragic error. As I said, there were individuals and groups trying to and succeeding to kill Westerners and Americans and American officials in opposing the values and the beliefs of non-conservative Islamic doctrines and practices long before 9/11. And we shouldn't let anyone kill anybody. And so it's a legitimate focus, an appropriate focus of the counterterrorism authorities of the U.S. intelligence community or the Indian intelligence community and law enforcement. And on some occasions of military, on some. But it's not, even in India, even in Pakistan, Pakistan's more debatable, and in the United States, it is not the number one existential threat facing the world's most powerful country.
All right. So,
but it became that, mm-hmm. and it has shaped American policy, and thus the world and our economy and our way of life for 25 years in a truly consequential way. The United States, in a benighted bit of delusion and misdirection and lies, invaded Iraq because some of the American leaders believed, and some didn't but were cynical, that terrorism was a threat from Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with Islamic terrorism. And that invasion was one of the great catastrophes in U.S. foreign policy history. In 240 years of America's existence, it's one of the greatest errors and disasters encountered. There have been, as a result of this misunderstanding, poor decisions, there have been hundreds of thousands of people killed. The United States has spent, I think it's $8 trillion, and we have been chasing a delusion.
So let me interject here. So there is an argument to be made that, in a way, Osama bin Laden and the Taliban are Frankenstein's monsters. You fought the jihad against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It was an American idea, backed by Saudi money, and fueled by Pakistani fervor. And it was the Pakistanis, the inter-services intelligence in particular, that used the jihadis against the Soviets. But once the Soviets fell, those jihadis were to be used first against India, and then, of course, they got bored. After all, they needed shits and giggles. So the great Satan, the US, appeared in their sights. So in a way, it was something you created, and then you took your eye off the ball.
Yeah, this is a widely shared narrative. Many Indians believe it. It is also, and this is not just an assertion on my part, it's also directly part of a KGB disinformation operation to present that narrative.
Oh, you mean it had nothing to do with Charlie Wilson's War? That's just a fictional Hollywood movie.
And it's largely inaccurate. As I said before you raised this specific question, the challenge, the problem, the reality of Islamically inspired terrorist acts predates 9/11, not just by decades, but actually by a century, arguably. There is substantial Islamic terrorism and terrorist groups active in Egypt in the 70s, and Egypt long before, and in many Islamic societies long before. The German intelligence service and high command directly sought to inspire Islamic terrorism as well as a global jihad against the Raj.
That's true.
In 1914 and before then.
Yeah.
And the examples are, there are many, many more examples of how Islamic terrorism and violent hostility to the West now let me continue. Long predates and is independent of anything that the United States did in Afghanistan. Now, what happened in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen also were completely organic and independent of anything the CIA did or the United States government did prior to the CIA's involvement with them, which and the CIA was involved with the Mujahideen, but they existed beforehand. Saudi money, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and elsewhere, inculcating a less tolerant version of Islam, long predates and is independent of anything the CIA did. The social dislocations in Islamic societies that lead to disaffection and the decision of very small numbers of angry, idealistic, almost invariably Muslim males to commit acts of violence against the kufr, the infidel, the established powers, long predates, is much broader geographically and culturally than anything the CIA ever conceived of doing with respect to the Mujahideen and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So it's frankly completely bogus, although widely believed that one can attribute the whole problem of Al-Qaeda and I'm not done, of Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism having metastasized from what the CIA did in Afghanistan. Now, what did the CIA do? President Reagan President Carter first started came through the CIA, so CIA support to the Mujahideen after the Soviet invasion. It became substantial in the degree of actions and support, money and arms, with President Reagan. But what happened to the money? And it's important. Pakistan said to the United States, said to the CIA, you may only come here you may come here, but we will make all decisions as to whom you meet and to whom you provide any aid at all. So we might have X dollars but we could only give it to the Pakistanis who then distribute it. So it's true, Charlie Wilson was a congressman in the Congress. I had interactions with Wilson, but that's another tale.
That's for another session.
And he pushed to provide lethal aid, which the United States, through the CIA, did to the Mujahideen. But it was the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, that decided to whom it would go. And they made substantially different decisions than the CIA would have, but we did not have input. What did then happen? And there's always, as I say, all stereotypes and all stories, are based on some truth. So the KGB narrative, which is widespread and widely shared in India, unfortunately, but it is wrong, not just in India. What did happen was the foreign fighters, the non-Afghan Muslims who were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan were, in percentage of those actually fighting, minuscule. We're talking several hundreds of people. Don't hold me to the number, but it was in the percentage of overall Mujahideen, it was very, very small. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda received a lot of the attention, but in what happened in the war, they were not consequential. There were few, but there were numbers of them. Many of them came from two places in particular. Not exclusively, but I'm simplifying. Egypt and Algeria. Now, why Algeria? Algeria had gone through a hideous, indescribably horrible, maybe all war is horrible indescribably, but
civil war in the
horrible
1990s.
Civil war and why did they have the Civil War? For the classic reasons, the resentments of and distortions caused by 2 centuries or a century and a half of colonialism.
French colonialism.
But more than the colonialism in this instance, a century and a half of social revolution and dislocation by a Western, more economically, technologically advanced society on a traditional culture. And what has always been the response of these traditional cultures to the dislocations caused by this overwhelming invasion or pressure on cultural norms and social and economic technological practices is self-questioning. Oh my God, how is it that this kafir here is more powerful than I am and telling me what to do? This is not acceptable because I want to lead my own life. Indians and any colonial people have some experience with the feelings of, what is this white guy telling me what to do? Particularly when you add in the religious element, and in particular the Islamic one, this is an existential crisis. And so over and over, what is the response culturally to this crisis? Well, if you believe that you have the truth, and by definition your religion is the only true religion.
It's truth with a capital T.
Truth with a capital T. The only possible explanations are either I have been misled, the truths I believe are not true, but that can't possibly be true. That's apostasy at best. Or, what has to be the case, we have strayed or we have been misled from the truth by the kufr, by the outsider. And what do you have to do then? You have to cleanse yourself and purge the distortions and the evil and the oppression that comes from the colonial outside oppressor. And so you will reject and you will try to expel by purifying. Most people, overwhelming majority of people, will try to do this in a humane way. Gandhi comes to mind.
Gandhi, by the way, was part of the Khilafat movement, a movement that sought to restore the caliph in Turkey, 1919.
Yeah. Some small percentage, and we're talking a fraction of a percent, will be so idealistic and so enraged that they will say, that's not enough, and I must act to do good, and I will commit violence.
So, hold fire.
And that's what happened It was not that the CIA created Al-Qaeda. Now,
Hold
did
fire,
the
hold
war
fire.
create
We
more dislocations and therefore perhaps
Yeah.
foment more of this phenomenon? That certainly is true.
So, hold fire, you take your
the
point.
narrative is very different from the one that is widely shared.
All right, hold fire. For a moment, we take your point about Al-Qaeda. Let's talk about the Indian perspective on Pakistan. Indian perspective on Pakistan. Pakistan was a Cold War ally. Pakistan lost in 1971. It was divided into Bangladesh, and Pakistan suffered consistently from terrorism. And because Pakistan was such a valuable Cold War ally, it ended up leaving fertile ground for what you call KGB disinformation campaigns. So on Pakistan, what was the CIA take then, and what is the CIA take now? Or you can't speak for the CIA, of course, but what is your judgment and what is the American assessment?
Well, for decades, the U.S. has found itself in a dilemma with Pakistan. And an American president, Thomas Jefferson, said something to the effect of, others have said a similar thing. He said, once you catch the tiger and are holding it by the ears, what do? You can't let go, but you don't want to be holding a tiger either. And it's how do you get out of that fix? The dilemma for the United States has since 1959, I would say. I think it was 1959, when maybe 58, when the United States decided that for strategic reasons in our clash with the Soviet Union, Pakistan was useful and important to us. And that was because Pakistan offered, India refused, as I recall, Pakistan offered to let us use its territory to fly spy planes over the Soviet Union.
Not just for the US and for India, but now we face a greater dilemma, and that is China. In 2001, the year when you suffered the 9/11 attacks, that is the same year China entered the WTO. And arguably, America was distracted for 20 years, whilst China followed Deng Xiaoping's dictum. It hid its strength and bided its time. And now, do you think, now that we are in the new decade, the real challenge for the US is not Russia really, but China?
Well, the issue of the century, or at least the first quarter and the second quarter of the century, the 21st century, has been, will be, the rise of China and how that affects the globe.
A Harvard man has come up with a book called The Thucydides Trap.
That's right. That's right.
Taking us right back to the beginning.
Yeah, a professor named Allison, his book Thucydides Trap analyzes moments in the entire course of recorded human history when a stable international system changes.
Yeah. It's the clash between a ruling power and a rising power.
Yes. And what happens? And the professor has identified 20 instances in the 8,000 years of recorded history when this has happened. And in 16 of the 20 instances, the challenge from a rising power to the status quo power. The United States is clearly the status quo superpower, who things have been as they are, and the United States would like to keep them as they are, the status quo. When a rising power challenges a status quo power, 16 times out of 20 in human history, the only way this changed circumstance has been resolved is through a major war. That's 4 out of 5. So that's pretty alarming. And this is the challenge for, more than anybody, American policymakers, is how to respond in this century to the rise of China.
We share a tiny border with them. Only 3,000 kilometers or so.
This is the great dilemma. the most important deciders are, of course, in Beijing and Washington. And I think pretty clearly the most important ones are in Beijing. Because you touched upon how has the U.S. responded. You mentioned the WTO. There are two schools of thought, pretty much, in the United States, and roughly broken down to conservatives, Republicans, or progressives, or moderates, and Democrats.
We've got both in the audience. We've got a Texan Republican, and we've got a progressive.
Well, one of them is right. No, for 30 years, since China has started to open to transform itself, its economy, its society, its government, and become more integrated, open to the world, the dominant American policy has been that integration with the international economic system and other societies will lead to transformation. The conservatives always argued that that was naive and would be proven wrong, and that China, by definition, because of its nature, was an existential threat to the United States and to global stability, because it was an aggressive totalitarian power. But for 30 years, yes, U.S. policy was to embrace integration and to help China make these transformations. Thus, U.S. support for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, that would help establish the rule of law and private property and transparency in transactions and in public discourse and so on. I would argue that that position, policy, was quite successful, progressively so, until 2012. It doesn't mean that there have always been, I'll put it more simply, there have always been, nonetheless, there have always been quite open, clear Chinese leaders and dynamics that have resented the West, vowed never to be put in a position of a century of humiliation, de facto colonization and domination again, that China's rightful position was to reject the hypocritical imperialistic norms of the UN system, which were all rationalizations for US capitalist domination, and to, at the minimum, be the hegemon in Asia and possibly to replace the United States essentially as the determining power in the global order. There have always been, every society has different currents, but there certainly have been strong currents that believe that in China, even while US policymakers have advocated this integration, progressive integration. I would argue, I think the data is pretty clear, that the numbers of Chinese who share what I'll call the Western norms, the percentages in Chinese society have consistently grown over the decades of opening to the West. But individuals count for a lot. And if you have Deng Xiaoping as your chairman, or you have Xi Jinping as your chairman.
Emperor Xi Jinping, as I call him.
You change the world. If you have Donald Trump as president, or Joe Biden as president, it's a different world. And Xi Jinping is literally the son of one of the subscribers to, believers in the left wing of the Communist Party, going back to Mao. His father did the Long March with Mao and was it's called the Gang of Four. It was sort of the most radical wing, most anti-imperialist, anti-Western wing of the power. And he believes, I don't know that he believes in communism, but he believes in the rule of a single party, that China, that a hierarchical society and state is the best way to run a society for everybody, and that America is a threat, and that it would be better that Beijing make the decisions than the United States, and that the United States should not be off the coast of China, and to push it back, and to reject many of the norms that have governed the international, like the law of the sea or trade negotiations and so on. Deng Xiaoping, while being an ardent nationalist, and he promoted Chinese interests, not American interests. He
no, as we said in our podcast,
profoundly different from Xi Jinping.
He actually had a much rougher life than Xi. Deng was actually someone who was self-made, went through civil war, went through the Long March, and was a man who was like steel that has been tempered. Xi's a princeling.
I think Deng is one of the great figures of the last 100 years. But anyway, so I think that's what, I'm sort of gone off on a little tangent, but I think that's what's happening, and that's the issue. It's still a clash between these two views of how to respond to China in the United States. And clearly the dominant view in the Chinese leadership is that of Xi, which is that China will take no guff from the United States whatsoever. It doesn't reject the international economic system because it is quite sensible and realizes that's how China also benefits. But it is far more aggressive than China was prior to Xi.
So this,
also far more powerful.
So the stage is set for greater tension, potential confrontation.
At least so long as Xi remains emperor.
Excellent. On that note, thank you very much, Glenn. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor. Welcome to IIT Gandhinagar again, and we'll now take you for dinner.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.